Hi, my name is Peter Nelson. I am president of Nelson Insurance Advisors. We specialize in using non-woke Catholic fraternal insurance companies in order to protect our clients and members, whether it be in regards to life insurance or retirement planning. We have over 23 years of experience in the insurance industry, and we want to do business with people that believe the way that we believe. So please reach out to us at 423-793-2613, or you can find us on our website at nelsonplan.com. God bless and Godspeed.
We've heard the term thrown around against Catholics, like the types who typically watch stuff like this. The term is prophets of doom. The first time that phrase was used, to my knowledge, was when John the 23rd gave an address before the cardinals and said he kind of decried those who were worried about, well, changes in the church and in society as prophets of doom, thought to be alluding to the Fatima message of all things, as well as to those who were demanding it be released in 1960. It's not a new term. And when we are talking about this birth of a new religion that calls itself Catholic, that some contend goes back to Vatican II itself. Others say, well, it's the new synodal church. Might be something in between, really. But there are actual false prophets of this new religion. And one of them is a man by the name of Cardinal Cobo. Those of you who are familiar with the church in Spain will know that Cardinal Cobo is a cardinal who was elevated to the post by Pope Francis. He would be perfectly at home with the likes of Cardinal Cupich, the Bishop Batzings of the Church of Germany, and other high-profile heterodox bishops and cardinals. But he's a relative newcomer to the episcopate. He's been the Archbishop of Madrid since 2023, elevated to that post by Pope Francis in September of that year. To call him progressive is to put it mildly. He supports fiducia supplicans and is all about the inclusion of the James Martin types. He pledged in January of last year to, quote, fully apply the declaration in the fiducia supplicans in the Archdiocese of Madrid, and dismissed worldwide backlash as an artificial controversy, reprimanding priests who publicly opposed it, including questioning their fidelity to the Pope. This is a man who publicly called any Catholic into question who resisted fiducia supplicans. He's, now that having been said, he's also been opposed to James Martin's parody of holy matrimony, calling it, he compared it to celebrating the Mass using Coca-Cola instead of sacramental wine. Broken clocks are right twice a day, they say, right? And that's a pretty good analogy coming from him. But he's been on the sort of left-wing progressive side of every issue that involves a church secular state conflict. In Spain, they've got an issue with a national monument put up by Franco that was very Catholic, a monument. And the secular media and the secular authorities want to tear the monument down, but they know they can't get away with that, at least not yet. But he is siding essentially with a secular solution to it. He's also extremely pro-migration. This is a Bergoglian through and through. We go to Religion Digital, which is a sort of Christian-ish news service out of Europe, under the headline, Cobo proposes a church that looks from the square and rebuilds the broken bonds of a wounded world. Now, the world is certainly wounded. It is wounded by sin. It is wounded by its rejection of the gospel. It's wounded, at least in part, by the actions of heretical and monstrous clergymen and the bishops who protected them. And it can be argued that it is wounded, at least in part, because of the revolution in the church that happened starting before the 60s, but really came to the forefront and out in the open in Vatican II and afterwards. We saw it at the council with those who were supposed to be advising the bishops, giving them really terrible advice, heretical advice that a lot of the bishops gleefully went along with. We saw it in the implementation of Vatican II. We saw it in the ambiguity in the documents. We saw it there. That was their coming out party. But that had been a problem in the church for decades, if not longer, simply by virtue of the popes, going back to Gregory the 16th and earlier, more than a century and a half before the council, needing to write about this creeping error of liberalism, both classical and left-wing politics, as well as modernism in general in the episcopate. They were writing about this in the 1820s going forward. So it was not exactly a new problem, but after attempts to stamp it out, it came out at Vatican II fully. And Bishop Cobo is wanting to continue the job. He spends a lot of time here in this report. He submitted a report to the Spanish bishops that goes over a lot of issues. I'm not going to go over most of them. But here he starts talking about the workplace, and this is where it gets weird. He called it, under the heading of work, an unavoidable place for the church's mission. Now, I'm of the mind that every place is an unavoidable place for the church's mission. The church has every right to comment on economics, has every right to talk about political action, has every right to talk about everything because the gospel applies to everything in our lives. However, they often conflate, these men do, the gospel with certain politics. And I would be equally annoyed, by the way, if they were trying to co-opt the gospel to promote secular right-wing politics. That would be pretty bad too. Anyway, under this heading, this is where it gets weird. It says, during his address, Cardinal Cobo described the world of work as one of the places where disengagement is most silent but most damaging. Work is increasingly dehumanized and becomes a mere factor of production. Workers are reduced to mere functions and depersonalized, with precarious, poorly paid jobs, even under exploitative conditions. You know, he's not wrong here. Now remember, this is the bishop who calls for unending migration, which is essentially keeping jobs in a domestic capacity, but replacing the workers with new labor and exploiting those who arrive, giving them cheap wages, and thereby just it's exploitation all around. And yet, here he is talking about exploitation in the workplace. This being concerned about good workplace conditions and being for unending migration are conflicts. You cannot hold both of those coherently at the same time. He goes on saying he specifically mentioned migrant workers in irregular administrative situations, meaning they're off-the-book employees, and the hyperflexibility that disrupts life trajectories. He recalled the teachings of John Paul II, who stated that, quote, work is the key, perhaps the essential key to the whole social question, and that of Francis, who emphasized that work is, quote, the great theme of our time, to insist that reintegration into the workforce is an unavoidable target of the church's mission, a privileged place to restore dignity, relationships, and meaning. And, you know, Francis wasn't wrong when he said that you should bring your faith to work with you, obviously. Now, what he meant by your faith, we can debate, but if you're a Catholic, your Catholic values don't stop at the door of your workplace. They should inform you to give your employer his due. You should honor your work commitments, and your faith should inform that, obviously. Now, given this situation, Cobo warned against defeatism. The world is not for prophets of doom, which are forbidden during Advent, because it is false prophecy. Faithful prophecy is that which sees reality as a challenge and learns to discover the seeds and nurturing of God. He reminded everyone that, quote, the Holy Spirit arrives before we do and works even while we sleep. We are collaborators in the kingdom, not its conquerors. The conquerors of the kingdom. That's not what the prophets of doom are. There's a whole lot of actually apocalyptic kind of prophecy that goes around Advent. After all, what is Advent? It is a preparation for the birth of our Lord. It is not exactly hard to go from the birth of our Lord to his second coming in terms of theological analysis and things. It's not forbidden during Advent. If you actually go look at the theology surrounding Advent, there was a whole lot of prophecy of doom. As one person in the live chat before the live stream noted, the prophets of the Old Testament were prophets of doom. All of them were. It's amazing. To address this changing era, Cardinal Cobo proposed several new wineskins. The first and most extensive is fraternity expressed in open, welcoming, and warm communities. Faced with widespread disconnection, Jesus' message leads us to connect. Connect not ideologically, but through fraternity. And when these guys use the word ideologically, they always mean not hammering home the supremacy of the Catholic faith, right? That's kind of how they always frame it, as opposed to, say, the truth of the Catholic faith, which is how we would describe it. but through fraternity, by being good friends, by being chums, hanging out, being friendly to one another, having synodal encounters and dialogue sessions, but never the truth. Hence, to connect not through the truth, but through good feelings. He used a domestic image to illustrate this, emphasizing that, quote, individualism and unwanted loneliness are combated with the comfort of grandma's house, the table always open where there was always coffee. I'm guessing most of you watching this had Catholic grandmothers, and they were pretty hard line, most of them, in sticking to the truth. Yeah, you could have a good time with your grandmother, but if you were clearly straying from the faith, she'd let you know, probably. And he goes on to this and talks about, essentially popularizing the faith in terms of turning it into political action. And that's really weird. Really weird, because when he means political action, he means the same kind of nonsense we hear from the Vatican all these times. He describes the plaza, the public square where this is to take place, as our living room. That would be great if he could describe it that way and was doing this as part of a broader call for conversion, for laymen to form associations of Catholic action, to go to the plazas, to go to the street corners and preach the gospel, calling people to conversion, to repentance, to walk away from sin, to embrace Jesus Christ as the only means of salvation. I would be applauding him. But it's not. He frames everything in fraternity. And if you oppose that, you are a prophet of doom. It's a new religion, folks. That's what this is. It's a religion based on friendship. I'm going to ask you this question here. I ask this all the time. Why is it that the Catholic Church seems to be the only religion on the planet that cares what other religions and practitioners of those religions and their leaders think of us? Why are we the only ones? I'm sure you can find some, Methodist minister or something out there who also has this very synodal view of things. As a general rule, it's the Catholic Church that cares a whole lot about what other religions think of us. And for the life of me, I can't figure out why. Unless, of course, the mission of the synodalists is to create a all-inclusive religion that doesn't challenge anybody, views God in vague, friendly kinds of terms, and preaches a de facto universal salvation. That's probably the only way you can get around that. Now, I'm very curious what you think about this. So let me know what you think about this in the comments, please. And I want to show you something here that is, I think, directly related to this. You will be aware, without question, that the Pope, through Cardinal Fernandez, issued a document on Marian devotions, Marian titles, all the rest of it. And yesterday on social media, Dr. Kwasniewski shared something. This is an open letter that is seems to be inviting people to sign it. I'll put a link in this Anthony Stine Substack for you to, if you want to go and interact and sign it. But it's a filial appeal to the Holy Father, Pope Leo XIV, following the publication of the doctrinal note Mater Populi Fidelis. It's the document that essentially demoted the Virgin Mary, made it so you're not supposed to use terms like co-redemptrix and mediatrix of all graces and those kind of things. Although Cardinal Fernandez did a few days ago step forward and say, remind people that in your private devotions, if you understand the terms, you can use it. There's a whole condescending tone to the entire original document. But the entire document is, like I keep saying, really concerned with what non-Catholics believe about the Catholic faith and about what non-Catholics have to say about the Catholic faith, that we should be worried about their opinion of us. It's strange. I don't understand it. Don't really understand it at all. The Church's primary mission is the salvation of souls. And we know, without question, that many Catholics don't believe Catholic dogmas, which means many Catholics are in fact not Catholic because they are heretics. They know the Church teaches that the Eucharist is the body, blood, soul, and divinity of Jesus Christ, not a symbol. There are certainly symbolic aspects to the Eucharist, but the Eucharist is not a symbol. It is truly our blessed Lord present under the guise of bread and wine. And yet, many Catholics know this but don't believe it. Many Catholics openly reject the Church's teaching on various forms of morality. You would think that the prefect for the dicastery of the doctrine of the faith would be far more worried about that than whether many Catholics don't understand Our Lady's role in the redemption of the human race. Here is Dr. Peter Kwasniewski and others writing an open letter to the Pope in much more diplomatic language than I would use personally, but then again, maybe they're better suited for this kind of thing than I am. Here's the letter. It's not very long. Most Holy Father, with filial devotion, we address this appeal to your holiness, giving humble voice to the dismay and consternation felt by a significant portion of the holy people of God after the publication, on the 4th of November, 2025, of the Mariological Note Mater Populi Fidelis, issued by the Dicastery for the Doctrine of the Faith. As children of the Church, our consciences are profoundly troubled as we read the statements contained in this note regarding certain Marian titles that refer to the cooperation of Mary Most Holy in the work of our salvation. How can we not be afflicted to see this new Mariological position set itself in clear opposition to the teaching handed down until now, teaching which has always recognized in the Virgin Mary a unique, real, and maternal role in the economy of redemption? The issue is not, as the note might seem to suggest, merely one of replacing or updating certain titles judged ambiguous or inopportune, but rather of cutting away, together with the titles Co-Redemptrix and Mediatrix of all graces, the very doctrine these titles embody. Indeed, the Catholic truth concerning Mary's active cooperation in the saving work of her Son appears to be reduced, if not denied outright, as though such cooperation could stand in contradiction to the sole mediation of Christ, rather than being rooted in it and wholly dependent upon it. We therefore ask ourselves whether we must conclude that the saints, the doctors of the Church, including St. John Henry Newman, whom your holiness proclaimed a doctor of the Church, and the numerous popes who taught this doctrine were all mistaken. Even your own homily of the 9th of June, 2025, delivered for the Jubilee of the Holy See, in which you described the Virgin as the new Eve, associated with the redeeming death of her divine Son, now seems cast into shadow. The intent of the note, unfortunately, appears clear. For unspecified ecumenical reasons, it seeks to minimize the great Mariology developed by the Church Fathers, the great theologians, and the Magisterium, a Mariology substantially reflected as well in Chapter 8 of Lumen Gentium. Mary is presented in Mater Populi Fidelis as a simple disciple of Jesus, whose cooperation is merely receptive and subordinate to that of the Church, without a true acknowledgement of what the Most Holy Virgin has done for us in bringing us to new life in the supernatural order. Either Mary is our mother or she is not, and if she is, she cannot exercise only a passive role in relation to the primacy and omnipotence of Christ's saving action. Mary is associated with Christ, just as Eve was with Adam. Eve with Adam was the cause of our ruin. Mary in Christ and with Christ was the cause of our salvation. See St. Irenaeus of Lyons. If the note was justified, what then would become of the miraculous medal, the scapular of Our Lady of Mount Carmel, the innumerable ex votos that adorn our Marian shrines, the Holy Rosary, and all the Marian devotions that presuppose and embody the true and maternal mediation of Mary? Holy Father, we desire to remain faithful to the patrimony of Catholic doctrine and to the perennial faith of the Church. For this reason, with filial trust, we beg your holiness to hear our sorrow and to intervene in whatever manner you deem most fitting, so that the honor, truth, and special veneration owed to the most blessed Virgin Mary, Mother of God and our Mother, may be restored. Confident in your pastoral solicitude, we commend your holiness to the protection of our most holy Mother with sentiments of filial obedience. Then you can go ahead and click that link if you wish to sign it and all the rest. And now I personally won't be signing it, not out of any objection to the document. I just recognize that I can be a controversial figure, and I think my name on it would be probably causing more harm than good. But if you feel that an open letter signed by preeminent minds associated with Orthodox Catholicism would help, as well as the signatures of laymen, I'll put a link to this in the Anthony Stine Substack not long after the initial broadcast of this. But that is what Dr. Kwasniewski and the other authors of this piece have said. It is very true. There's a very obvious issue there, which is what happens to traditional devotions if you strip the Virgin Mary of her role of participation, of active participation, shall we say, in the redemption of the human race. We don't make the claim that she is of equal footing to Christ. Far from it, in fact. But her role was rather significant nonetheless. Once you take or diminish and try to minimize her role in these things, you suddenly make those devotions suspect. And of course, it's for ecumenical reasons. We saw that in the document itself repeatedly. Again, why do we care so much about what non-Catholics think of the Catholic faith? I'm very curious again what you think of this, so let me know in the comments. What do you think of that letter? Think it'll do any good? Let me know. I'm skeptical of open letters, petitions, anything of that kind. Very rarely do they have an effect, but we are seeing in some of the Latin Mass closures and suppressions happening in the US that some of the bishops are kind of aware of the public backlash and are looking to slow things down a little bit. So public letters may actually help. I'm kind of torn on this. Now, on a final note here, there is clearly among young Catholics a sort of push to return to a more Orthodox Catholicism. Reverent masses, whether they are ordinary form masses said very reverently or the traditional mass, are highly sought out by young people. We're seeing increasing numbers of vocations, especially young men, not just vocations, but conversions. Young men coming into the faith, young women too, but young men especially. They're seeking stability, an escape from the depravity of the culture. All is wonderful. We're also seeing that there is an increase in some quarters of some vocations, not just increased numbers of young conservative men attempting to enter the priesthood through the seminary, and pray for those men because the seminaries are often run by lavender types who want to keep good men out of the priesthood and more men like themselves there instead. But it seems that the seminaries are being overrun with good men, and that's not a problem in the slightest. But still pray for those men that they may stay the course, because there are a lot of pressures that they face while in the seminary. But there's another area where we're seeing an interesting turnaround in vocations. And we go here to the Catholic Herald for the initial part of this, and then after we go over this, I will show you the flip side of the story that may give some young women and young men pause in pursuing vocations. The headline from the Catholic Herald is, "Why Young Catholics Are Returning to the Habit and Cloth." When they say habit and cloth, they mean religious women, meaning consecrated women religious and nuns. They mean young men seeking to become friars and monks. They're seeing all of these things, as well as, of course, the priesthood. Great news across the board, especially if this is mostly happening in more traditional leaning kinds of communities, where the religious in question are wearing their habits, whether their habits are the robes we associate with monks or, the actual habits that we see from nuns and the like. Whatever the habit is, they're wearing it, meaning they are an outward sign of contradiction to the world and a clear sign of who they are supposed to be, that they've given their entire lives to Jesus Christ and his church, and that they live lives that are weirdly attractive for being so foreign in the minds of most normal people everywhere they go. And that they spend their time praying and working and fasting for our benefit, by the way, if you're not aware. And this is happening enough now that the Catholic Herald is picking up on this and deciding that they need to explain what's going on. After we go over this, I'll show you the sort of sword of Damocles hanging over all of them, though. After reading a recent article about the sister adorers of the Royal Heart of Jesus Christ Sovereign Priest and about young women becoming nuns, it got me thinking. Because only just a few years ago, when many of us were talking about a vocational crisis within the church, whether that be priestly or taking the habit. However, the article in the National Catholic Register, which describes how the order is drawing young women who seek a contemplative life rooted in tradition, adoration, and prayer for priestly vocations, suggests something else is going on. Seeing how young women, many in their early to mid-20s, are choosing to embrace the habit, to give themselves to prayer, contemplation, and the hidden life of a religious sister again, it is nothing less than a beautiful sign of hope. In a culture that often treats consecrated life as quaint or passé, this resurgence of the habit speaks of something far more profound, a growing respect for the clerical and religious state. Of course, society needs mothers, women who nurture families, rear children, and sustain household life. But there is something uniquely vital in this return of women to the religious habit, a rediscovery of spiritual motherhood, self-surrender, and the desire to intercede for souls. Where once nuns were caricatured as old-fashioned or severe, today the religious life is becoming recognized, even among young girls, as a blessed vocation, a sign of feminine strength and holiness rather than backwardness. What we are observing with these vocations rising, especially in Europe among traditional priestly societies, is not a trend but a rather quiet renaissance. Among the most visible signs is the growth of traditional liturgical groups that celebrate the Latin Mass. And when it says the Latin Mass, we don't mean the ordinary form in Latin. We mean the pre-Vatican II Mass. The brother organization, the Institute of Christ the King Sovereign Priest, for instance, now counts around 147 priests, clerical oblates, and affiliated clerics worldwide. Similarly, the Priestly Fraternity of St. Peter, FSSP, another traditional liturgical society in full communion with Rome, that's your solid dig at the SSPX. The SSPX are also in full communion with Rome. What they have is a not in status, canonically speaking. They do not deny the validity of the papacy. They do not deny the validity of the current pontiff. They say his name in the Mass. They chastise people who have doubts about Pope Leo and before him Pope Francis's validity. What they have is a non-status, canonically, because of the conflict they have with the Vatican. Something that should be worked out behind the scenes, instead of every person out there trying to fan the flames of division between the SSPX and Rome, but including authors of articles like this who take digs at them when they talk about the FSSP. As of 2024, FSSP reportedly has 583 members, including 386 priests and some 200 seminarians and candidates for holy orders. And I'll add that the SSPX has got about, I think, 700 priests now, just to add to this, to show how big this is happening, broadly speaking. Meanwhile, the Institute of the Good Shepherd, which is a mostly European priestly fraternity, lists 62 priests and some 44 seminarians active internationally. In many respects, admittedly, these figures stand in counterpoint to the broader global trend. According to recent reports, the total number of priests worldwide dropped to 406,996 in 2023, a fall of 734 in just a year. Seminarian numbers also declined globally from 108,481 major seminarians in 2022 down to 106,495 in 2023, a drop of nearly 2% in 1 year. Particularly in Europe and Asia, the decline was pronounced. Yet despite the discouraging global patterns, traditionally oriented institutes such as the Institute of Christ the King, the FSSP, and the Institute of Good the Shepherd seem to be thriving, or at least are holding steady. That may be small solace in the face of a global vocations decline, but I think the symbolic weight and spiritual significance are not to be underestimated. And then asks, why is this happening? And aside from disenchantment with secularism, here's what they say. Many young Catholics, both men and women, seem to be rediscovering the beauty of rootedness, of tradition, of sacrificial commitment. In a society saturated by consumerism and unstable values, the call to religious life, to celibacy, to prayer, to liturgical continuity appears as a radical alternative. That's obviously true on its face. Remember what I said at the beginning. This religious stand is a sign of contradiction to the world. The world pushes radical individualism. It promotes hedonism and pleasure and good time seeking at the expense of everything else in the name of self-actualization. True self-actualization, if you want to call it that, meaning becoming the best you can be, feel like, some late night comedy therapy skit when I say that, but becoming the best you can be only really happens at the foot of the cross. That is where it happens. It happens there and in the confessional. You make a good confession and you recognize Christ for who he is and what he did when he instituted a church, and you then live accordingly. That's becoming the best you can be. And for some Catholics, they are called to a religious life. That stands in contradiction to the hedonism of the world, to the chaos, the constant social revolutions going on. And it's another part of the broader things going on in the culture. We have seen in the political realm across the West a shift to the political right. We have seen that. It's happening in virtually every country. How long that lasts, we shall see. But there's signs that it's a realignment of sorts going on across the West. And with that, you'd expect a resurgence of religion to some degree. How big of a resurgence will this be? I don't think you're going to see a birth of a new Christendom. But things are going to return, at least move in the direction of cultural sanity, at least a little bit. Now, far be it for me to paint you a rosy picture, because there's a sort of Damocles that hangs over all of these new religious. You'll note that the article pointed out something. The author was correct. He said this is focused on traditional organizations. The FSSP, the Institute Christ the King, their affiliated religious groups, and as I interjected with, also the SSPX. All of them. They're all seeing increased vocations, increased association of religious men and women with their priestly fraternities, all while the traditional sacraments are being taken away from laity at the diocesan level. The priestly fraternities are still thriving, at least for now. We'll see if Rome takes action against them. But the sword of Damocles that's hanging over them is a quiet campaign to eliminate women religious orders. And I'll have more news on that in the coming days, I suspect, because a group I've covered a lot recently in the United States appears to be having negative things happen to them again. So stay tuned for that. But I want to show you, this is coming from Katholische.de, which is the official news arm of the German bishops. Their headline is, "The Goldenstein nuns write open letter to the Vatican. Serious accusations." This is what's left of this religious community. Habited nuns, all around 80 years old. Their only real wish is to live out their days in their convent. That's it. They want to keep the faith, wear their habits, live as nuns have lived for a couple thousand years now, and be recognizably Catholic, and to do so in their convent. And Rome at first, well, the bishop there, at first said, yes, we'll let that happen. And then he backed off. And the nuns just kind of decided to ignore him and move back into their convent anyway. This has caused a conflict. Now, keep in mind, Katholisch.de is the German bishops' news outlet, meaning you're going to hear the pro-bishop side take on this. But even then, it's hard for them to make it sound too convincingly pro-bishop on this, because they're not asking much. These are women who are like 80. They're asking to just live out their days the way they've lived their entire lives, in their habits, in their convent. And they've sought recourse to Rome, which hasn't exactly worked out well for nuns in the past few years who've been trying to do that. But maybe under Leo, they'll get a better turn of events and better response. We shall see. It's one of the things I've been watching to see how Leo handles women religious and the conflicts with their bishops. Here are the details from the German bishops. In the dispute over the occupation of Goldenstein Monastery near Salzburg, the 3 nuns living there have now also appealed to the Vatican. In a letter dated Tuesday, which is available to the Catholic News Agency, they request the removal of the superior, Provost Marcus Grassel of Reichsburg Abbey. The Vatican had appointed Grassel as head of the monastery in Austria, a common procedure when a religious order is too small to govern itself. The sisters are now writing to the relevant dicastery in the Vatican. Although his appointment at the time corresponded to our wishes, this wish later proved to be a mistake. They allege that Grassel repeatedly and seriously violated canon law. Among other things, he was unwilling to listen to the sisters' concerns about their future. He refuses any direct communication with us and communicates exclusively through the media, the letter states. Not very synodal of him. Instead, against our will, contrary to his own assurances, and in violation of state law, meaning government law, he expelled us from our convent and placed us in a nursing home. To prevent further damage to the church, the sisters are now requesting that Grassel be removed from his post and replaced by a new superior. The fate of the nuns, all over 80 years old, has made international headlines in recent months. At the beginning of September, they returned from a retirement home to their former convent against Grassel's wishes. The building has belonged to the Archdiocese of Salzburg and Reichsburg Abbey since 2022. The sisters state that they were originally promised a lifelong stay. However, after hospital stays, they had to move to a nursing home at the end of 2023. At the end of November, Grassel presented the nuns with an offer that would guarantee them the right to remain in the convent, quote, until further notice. That's remarkably different than a lifelong. When you're talking about people in their 80s, lifelong isn't probably not super long. That's very different than allowing them to stay there for the rest of their lives, as they've been promised before. Among the conditions was the cessation of their social media activities. In other words, they have to shut up. They have more than 220,000 followers on Instagram and returned to a secluded monastic life. The nuns rejected the agreement. Grassel then appealed to the Vatican to obtain a ruling. So both sides have appealed to the Vatican, and this will be handled by the same dicastery that has facilitated the crushing of women religious orders for the last several years. Now, under new leadership, maybe there'll be a different turn of events. This has been very bad PR for the Vatican consistently for the last decade. So maybe in this case, they'll be at least concerned about public relations and do the right thing. I, however, fully expect in the next few weeks to come to you with a bad news story involving this. So please pray for those women, religious. They spent their whole lives dedicated to church and to praying for your soul. Please pray for them. Wish I had some more material thing you could do, but all they want to do is live out their days in their convent and have a superior that they answer to who will allow that to happen and who will govern them instead of communicating to them through the media, of all things. I'm very curious what you think of this, so let me know in the comments. As one person says, they follow them on social media. Yes, they want them to shut up. They want them to be quiet. They want them to go along to get along and to be good members of the new synodal church by just doing what they're told, which would presumably mean, oh, sure, you can live in your monastery or your convent, and then eventually, oh, you got to move to a retirement home. Over all of this always hangs the question of private property. By private property, I mean property that had been in the hands of the religious, but now is owned by the diocese. Because we have seen when women religious, especially, when their orders are swept away, the bishop, usually in cahoots with the Vatican, sells the property. If you want to know why that is, it's because of all the McCarrick problems they had, all the old lawsuits. Many of them have lots and lots of debt they're paying off to the families' victims, the victims and the families of the wicked priests that their predecessors in the episcopate covered up their evil actions. Mathiello says the synodal church believes women should be running parishes and dioceses, not nuns. Well, sure, except unless, of course, these are very Orthodox women who, of course, would not want to be running a parish anyway. Then they need to be quiet, which is exactly what you're seeing here. They just want them to be quiet. So let me know. What do you think of this in the comments, please? Hit like and subscribe if you haven't. It does help. Sharing this on social media helps a lot too. Please pray for everybody we spoke about today, especially in a negative way. I'm not trying to whip you up in anger against them. Pray for them. Their salvation is of tantamount importance. And it is a great act of charity to pray for people, especially those whom you are probably not inclined to do so, to wish the best for those whom in your heart you really don't want the best for, to overcome that kind of barrier to your own salvation. So please pray for them. And always pray for the church. I'm Anthony Stine. Ave Maria.